My father, a legend of industry, toasted my brother as the heir to his steel empire. Then he looked at me and told 100 of his most powerful friends my life's work was little more than a child's hobby. In that moment, under the weight of 100 polite smiles, I had never felt more invisible. They had no idea their entire billion-dollar legacy was about to shatter. And I was the only person who knew how to pick up the pieces. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if you believe in the power of truth, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss how this ends. The air in the Houston Museum of Fine Arts was thick with expensive perfume and the low hum of old money. Crystal glasses clinked polite laughter, echoed off the marble floors, and I stood near a towering abstract sculpture, feeling about as warm and welcome as the art itself. This was my mother's world, a glittering stage for her annual charity gala, and tonight, the starring roles belonged to my father and my brother. My father, Aris Thorne, was a titan. Even in retirement, he had a gravitational pull, men half his age leaning in to catch every word, every story about the good old days when he built oil rigs with nothing but grit and a slide rule. He was a legend, and he never let anyone forget it. Standing beside him was my older brother Julian. Dressed in an impeccable Tom Ford suit, he was the new face of the Thorne Empire, the CEO of Thorne Energy. He was charming, ruthless, and he wore his ambition like a second skin. And then there was me, Dr. Aris Thorne. I wore a simple dark blue dress, elegant enough to pass inspection, but it felt like camouflage. In a room full of people who traded fortunes, I was the one who analyzed stress fractures in deep-sea structures. I didn't build empires, I kept them from collapsing. To my family, that made me the odd one, out the misfit. My mother, Evelyn, drifted over her smile, as carefully constructed as her diamond necklace. She said, "Aris, darling, you look well." The pause hung in the air, a tiny unspoken judgment. She didn't understand why I wasn't married to a banker or running a respectable division of the company. She patted my arm and moved on before I could even reply. I tried to busy myself pretending to study the painting next to me, but I could feel their eyes. The curious glances from my father's old colleagues, the whispers. "That's the daughter, the engineer." A shame, really. I had spent my entire life in their shadow, a constant quiet disappointment. The real performance began when my father tapped his glass for a toast. The room fell into a respectful hush. He beamed, raising his glass high. He spoke of legacy, of strength, of the Thorne name being synonymous with the steel that built this country. He looked directly at Julian. He said to my son Julian, "A man who understands that legacy isn't just about building things, it's about making them profitable. He is the future." The applause was deafening. Julian gave a modest, predatory smile. I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Then my father's eyes found me across the room. The warmth vanished. He cleared his throat. He continued, "And to my daughter, Aris. We are all so proud that she has found a passion in her academic pursuits and computer models. It is wonderful to have a hobby." He turned away. That was it. He had reduced my entire career, my PhD, the life-saving work I poured my soul into, to a hobby, in front of everyone. The silence that followed his words felt louder than the applause before it. I could see the pity in some faces, the smug satisfaction in others. My brother's smile widened just a fraction. He had won again. I stood perfectly still, my glass cold in my hand, my face a neutral mask I had perfected over decades. But inside, something didn't just break. It calcified, turning from hurt into something cold and heavy like lead. They saw me not as a professional, not even as a daughter, but as an afterthought, a footnote in the grand story of the Thorne men. His words, a wonderful hobby, echoed in my head, a sharp, stinging reminder of a conversation I wished I could forget. It had happened 6 months ago, not in a grand ballroom, but in the suffocating formality of my father's home office. The room smelled of old leather and ego. I had called the family meeting. I had come prepared. On the large oak desk, I had laid out a series of detailed schematics and stress simulation reports. My laptop was open, displaying a complex 3D model of the Thorne Alpha, one of the oldest deep-sea oil rigs my father had ever designed. It was the flagship of his legacy, and it was now the cornerstone of Julian's fleet. I pointed to a specific joint on the screen, a place where 3 support pillars converged deep beneath the ocean's surface. My simulations, run on some of the most powerful supercomputers in the world, showed a critical vulnerability. I explained it calmly, using precise professional language. The original design, groundbreaking for its time, didn't account for the cumulative metal fatigue caused by decades of deep-sea pressure and the new, more aggressive drilling techniques Julian's company had implemented. I told them the simulations predict a 70% chance of catastrophic structural failure within the next 12 months if the current operational tempo is maintained, especially with the cutbacks on deep weld maintenance. Julian had scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a dismissive wave of his hand. He said, "Aris, these are just numbers, projections. In the real world, we deal with quarterly earnings, not hypothetical disasters. We are running a business, not a science fair." I looked at my father, hoping for a flicker of understanding from the man who had taught me the basics of physics. He picked up my printed report, held it between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. He didn't look at the data. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, unyielding disappointment. He said, "Legacy Aris is not built on fear. It's built on courage. It's built on taking risks. My rigs have stood for 40 years. They are proven." I tried to argue. I said, "Courage doesn't defy physics, Dad. This isn't about fear. It's about prevention. It's about responsible engineering." He cut me off. He tossed the report back onto the desk. He stood up, his voice booming with the finality of a judge. He said the words that had haunted me ever since. "My legacy was built with steel and experience, Aris. Yours is built with computer models. Come back and talk to me when you've built something that actually exists in the real world." He and Julian had walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my warnings, with the undeniable truth of my data. It was the moment I realized they weren't just ignoring my expertise. They were rejecting the very essence of who I was. My knowledge wasn't just different from theirs. To them, it was inferior. It was a threat to the myth of the infallible Thorne men. Standing there in that museum, his condescending toast still hanging in the air, I wasn't just remembering that day. I was reliving it. The same dismissal, the same arrogance. Only this time it was on a public stage. They hadn't just silenced me in private. They had celebrated their ignorance in public. I pulled my attention back to the present, back to the grand ballroom in the sea of smiling faces. The memory of that meeting was a cold stone in my gut, but years of practice had taught me how to build a fortress around my emotions. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my lukewarm water, my face a carefully constructed mask of polite indifference. To anyone watching, I was just the quiet daughter, graciously accepting her place in the background. The applause for my father's toast finally subsided, and the polite hum of conversation resumed. A server moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes. Julian took one, his eyes finding mine over the rim of the glass. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of acknowledgement, but of victory. It was a look that said, "See, this is how the world works. Power, not projections, is what matters. My father, now holding court with a U.S. senator, launched into another one of his well-worn anecdotes. He was in his element, the patriarch, the sage, the man whose legacy was unassailable. I turned away, unable to watch the performance any longer. I found a quiet corner near the gallery's exit, the cool air from the hallway a small relief. That's when Aris Thorne's voice cut through the noise again, this time with a tone of paternal pride, so thick it was almost sickening. He was speaking to the senator, but he made sure his voice carried. He said, "And of course the real genius is Julian. He's the one who had the foresight to keep the Thorne Alpha operational, even when the so-called experts were advising a complete, and might I add, obscenely expensive overhaul." He looked pointedly in my direction. He continued, "He's trimming the fat, running a lean operation. That's what it takes to grow a legacy in today's world. Not just build it, but make it stronger, more efficient." Julian, ever the humble heir, chimed in. He said, "I just learned from the best dad. We can't let fear of what might happen paralyze us. We have to make tough decisions." Cutting those unnecessary maintenance protocols was a no-brainer. It saved our shareholders millions. It was a perfectly rehearsed duet of arrogance. They weren't just dismissing me now, they were publicly celebrating the very actions I had warned them against. They were boasting about their recklessness, framing it as brilliant business strategy. The senator nodded, sagely, completely captivated. Other guests who overheard murmured their approval. It was a masterclass in shaping a narrative. I was the timid academic clinging to worst-case scenarios. They were the bold visionaries, the risk-takers who always won. I felt a flush of anger, hot and sharp. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. This was a public execution of my credibility. In their story, I was the fool. The overcautious, impractical daughter who simply didn't understand the high-stakes world of men. They had taken my expertise, my science, my solemn warning, and twisted it into a punchline. A story they told to impress powerful people at cocktail parties. I stood there, invisible, unheard, as they toasted their own brilliance, completely oblivious to the fact that the clock on their legacy was just about to run out. I was about to turn and walk out to finally escape the suffocating performance when a flicker of movement caught my eye. It wasn't from the partygoers. It was from the enormous flat-screen television mounted discreetly on the far wall, which until now had been displaying a silent loop of the museum's art collection. The art vanished. The screen went blue. Then the jarring red and white banner of a cable news network flashed across it with the words, "Breaking news," pulsing beneath. The low hum of conversation in the ballroom faltered. A few heads turned toward the screen, annoyed by the interruption. My own heart gave a strange, sharp lurch. A news anchor appeared, his face grim. He said, "We are coming to you with breaking reports from the Gulf of Mexico. An emergency situation is unfolding at the Thorne Alpha offshore oil platform." The name hit the room like a physical blow. A sudden sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. The polite chatter ceased completely. Every single eye in that room, including the senators, snapped to the television. My father froze mid-sentence, his champagne flute hovering halfway to his lips. Julian's smile dissolved from his face, replaced by a look of stark disbelief. He pulled out his phone, his thumb fumbling to unlock it. On the screen, chaotic live footage from a news helicopter appeared. The Thorne Alpha, the very symbol of my father's legacy, was silhouetted against a darkening sky. It looked wounded, listing slightly to one side. The anchor's voice continued, his tone urgent. "We are getting unconfirmed reports of a critical structural failure. Communications with the platform have been lost." A graphic appeared on the right side of the screen. It was the live stock market ticker for Thorne Energy. A brutal vertical red line showed its value plummeting. The anchor said Thorne Energy stock has been halted after falling over 40% in the last few minutes, erasing an estimated $5 billion in market value. $5 billion. The number hung in the silent room, an impossible, devastating figure. I watched my father's face. The pride, the arrogance, the unshakable confidence, it all drained away, leaving behind the pale, slack-jawed shock of a man watching his entire world crumble on live television. Julian just stared at the screen, his face ashen, his phone forgotten in his hand. The empire he had inherited, the legacy he was boasting about just moments ago, was literally breaking apart in front of his eyes. The anchor's voice cut through the stunned silence once more, this time with a new piece of information. He said sources are now citing the cause of the incident as a catastrophic failure in a primary support joint, a disaster apparently linked to a combination of a decades-old design and recent cutbacks in key maintenance schedules. Design and maintenance. The exact 2 points I had raised in that office 6 months ago. The exact 2 things they had laughed at. The hobby, the computer models. The words came back to me not with a sting, but with the cold, heavy clarity of vindication. It wasn't joy. It was a hollow, aching certainty. I had been right, and my entire family, my entire industry was about to pay the price for them being so terribly, tragically wrong. The room remained frozen in a state of collective shock, the only sound being the grim voice of the news anchor narrating the disaster. No one spoke. No one moved. The air was thick with the smell of fear and evaporating fortunes. I watched my father. He looked smaller, older, as if the weight of his collapsing legacy was physically pressing him down into his expensive shoes. My brother Julian was a statue of pure panic, his face a mask of dawning horror. The sound started, then a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It grew louder, more insistent, a deep, guttural pulse that rattled the crystal glasses on the tables. Heads lifted from the television screen, eyes darting around the room in confusion. The sound was coming from outside. It was getting closer. Powerful landing lights suddenly flooded the grand arched windows of the museum, washing out the soft, ambient lighting of the party and casting long, distorted shadows across the marble floor. The rhythmic chopping sound was now deafening, a physical presence that shook the entire building. It was a helicopter, and it was landing right outside on the museum's main plaza, a place reserved for priceless sculptures, not aircraft. The side doors of the ballroom burst open. 2 figures strode in, not with the polite deference of the museum staff, but with the focused, urgent purpose of men walking into a crisis zone. They wore black flight suits, their shoulders squared, their eyes scanning the room with professional intensity. They ignored the senator, the billionaires, the socialites. Their gazes swept past my father and my brother as if they were nothing more than obstacles. Their eyes found me in the corner, and they walked directly towards me. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. The silence in the room was now absolute, a vacuum of stunned disbelief. The first man, his face grim and set, stopped a few feet in front of me. The roar of the helicopter outside began to recede as the engine spooled down. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spoke, his voice clear and sharp, cutting through the silence of the room. He said, "Dr. Thorne." I just nodded, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. He continued, his words precise and devoid of emotion. "The Secretary of Energy is on a secure line for you in the chopper. He has authorized full operational command. They told us you were the only one who predicted this scenario down to the last detail 6 months ago. The mobile command center is airborne and en route to the staging area." He took a half step back, his posture one of deferential readiness. He said the words that shattered the last remnants of my old life, and forge the foundation of my new one. Everything is ready, ma'am. Ma'am. Not heiress, not the hobbyist, not the daughter. Ma'am. It was a title of respect, of authority, of undeniable power. In that single word, the entire dynamic of my world, of that room, shifted on its axis. I was no longer the invisible woman in the corner. I was the commander, and the battle for my father's legacy had just become my war to win. For a single, drawn-out second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in that ballroom was locked on me, their expressions a mixture of confusion, shock, and a dawning unwelcome understanding. The man in the flight suit stood waiting, his posture unwavering. He had given his report. The next move was mine. I looked past him, my gaze sweeping across the room. I saw the senator, his mouth slightly agape, the polite political mask completely gone. I saw my mother, her hand pressed to her chest, her face a pale canvas of disbelief. I saw my brother Julian, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes, the panic of a man who has lost all control. Then my eyes met my father's. In that moment, he wasn't a titan. He wasn't a legend. He was just an old man, stripped of his pride, his face pleading. He took a half step forward, his hand slightly outstretched, as if he was about to speak, to ask, to beg. What he wanted, I wasn't sure. An explanation. Forgiveness, help. I gave him nothing. I turned my back on him. I turned my back on all of them. I gave a single sharp nod to the man in the flight suit. I said, "Lead the way." My voice didn't shake. It was calm, level, the voice of a professional who has a job to do. The years I had spent feeling small in their presence, the decades of swallowing insults and coded dismissals, it all fell away. It was dead weight I no longer had to carry. As I walked towards the doors, the two men fell into step on either side of me, a silent, formidable escort. The crowd which had parted for them now remained parted for me. I didn't rush. My steps were measured, deliberate. The sound of my simple heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the vast, silent room. I didn't look at anyone. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on the exit, on the mission that was waiting for me. I could feel their stares on my back, 100 pairs of eyes trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew, the quiet academic daughter, with the commander who was now walking out of their lives and into the heart of a national crisis. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single glance back. They didn't deserve my anger. They didn't deserve my triumph. They didn't deserve anything from me at all. As I stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool night air, into the blinding lights of the waiting helicopter, I wasn't just walking away from a party. I was walking away from the person they had always wanted me to be. The moment the helicopter doors sealed shut, the glittering, suffocating world of the museum vanished. Inside it was a different universe. The cabin was stripped of all luxury, replaced by the stark, functional beauty of a mobile command unit. Screens glowed with data streams, schematics, and secure satellite uplinks. The air crackled with the quiet, focused energy. This wasn't a place for egos or pleasantries. This was a place for work. One of the crew handed me a headset. I slipped it on the world of the gala, instantly replaced by the calm, professional voice of the pilot in the secure channel to Washington. The Secretary of Energy was already on the line. He didn't waste time. He said, "Dr. Thorne, good to have you. The situation is critical. The president is being briefed. Your team is already patched in. You have full command. Tell us what you need." The woman they called a hobbyist just an hour ago was now giving orders that would mobilize millions of dollars in federal assets. I took a deep breath, not of panic, but of purpose. It felt like coming home. I said, "Secretary, I need live feed, seismic data from the seafloor, real-time pressure readings from every sensor on that rig, and I want the Odyssey, the deep-sea remote robotics vessel, deployed to these coordinates immediately." I rattled off the numbers from memory. There was no hesitation on the other end. The secretary just said, Done. For the next hour, as the helicopter carved a path through the night sky toward the Gulf, I became a different person. The quiet, reserved Aris Thorne was gone. In her place was the leader of a highly specialized team, a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony of science and logistics. My fingers flew across the touchscreen, pulling up the 3D models I had built 6 months ago. They were no longer hypothetical. They were now the only map we had through this disaster. My team, the best structural engineers and deep-sea robotic specialists in the world, appeared on screen one by one from their own command posts across the country. There was no surprise in their faces, only a grim readiness. They had seen my reports. They had trusted my data. They knew this day was coming. I said, "All right, team, let's get to work. I want a full diagnostic on the P12 support joint. Cross-reference the live pressure readings with the fatigue simulations we ran in March. I need to know the exact failure threshold we're dealing with. Let's see how wrong they were." The words came out of me effortlessly, a language of precision and command I had spent my entire career mastering. This was my world, not the whispered condescension of a ballroom, but the clear, sharp, high-stakes reality of a crisis. Here, my knowledge wasn't a curiosity, it was a weapon. My computer models weren't a hobby. They were the only thing standing between a damaged rig and a catastrophic environmental disaster. The contrast was so stark, it was almost laughable. Back at that party, they were celebrating a legacy of steel. Here, in the heart of the storm, everyone was betting on a legacy of data, my data. We were about 40 minutes into the flight, deep in the complex dance of data analysis and strategic deployment, when a different sound cut through the focused quiet of the cabin. It wasn't a secure line or a system alert. It was the shrill, insistent ring of my personal cell phone. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. My personal life had ceased to exist the moment I stepped onto this helicopter. But a glance at the screen sent a jolt of cold recognition through me. The caller ID simply read Julian. A part of me, a small, weary part, wanted to silence it, to let it go to voicemail, to deal with it later. Or never. But another part, the part that was now in command, knew that avoidance was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every variable in this crisis had to be managed. And my brother, the CEO of the company, whose asset was currently threatening to tear itself apart, was a very significant variable. I muted my headset microphone, isolating myself from my team. I answered the call. His voice came through strained and sharp with panic. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if I was all right. He demanded, "Aris, what the hell is going on? What's the status? My people are completely locked out of the system. I'm the CEO. I need access." The sheer, unadulterated entitlement in his voice was breathtaking. After everything that had happened, after the public humiliation, after the disaster that his arrogance had directly caused, his first instinct was not to ask for help, but to demand control. He still saw me as his little sister, someone he could bark orders at. I kept my own voice low and steady, a wall of ice. I said, "Julian, you are not locked out. Your company's access was suspended by federal order the moment this became a national security event. You no longer have operational authority." There was a sputtering sound on the other end. He said, "National security? That's my rig, my company. My shareholders are getting wiped out. You have to tell me what's happening. You have to do something to stop the bleeding." I listened to the desperation in his voice, the raw fear of a man watching his kingdom burn. He wasn't worried about the crewmen still trapped on that platform. He wasn't worried about the coastline that was threatened by a potential oil spill. He was worried about his stock price. He was worried about his money. I said, "What I am doing, Julian, is preventing a multi-billion-dollar asset from becoming a multi-trillion-dollar environmental catastrophe. My team and I are working. He cut me off. He said, "Your team Aris, listen to me. You need to route your data stream through my office. Let my PR team handle the public statements. We need to control the narrative here. We can frame this as an unforeseen." I didn't let him finish. I had listened to him shape narratives my entire life. I had watched him twist truths to feed his own ego and line his own pockets. Not anymore. I said, "Julian, I am going to say this once. Do not contact me on this number again." Any official requests from Thorne Energy can be submitted through the Department of Energy's Public Liaison Office. I am busy. And then I did something I had never done before in my entire 42 years of life. I hung up on my brother. I disconnected the call, ending the conversation on my terms. I blocked his number without a second thought and slid the phone back into my pocket. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of operational necessity. He was a distraction, a liability. And in a crisis, you neutralize liabilities. While I was drawing a hard line with Julian, my father, Aris Thorne, was fighting a different kind of war. He wasn't in a helicopter rocketing towards the disaster. He was still at the museum, surrounded by the ruins of his perfect evening, and he was doing what he had always done when faced with a problem he couldn't physically dominate. He was working the phones. I found this out later from my mother. In a breathless, rambling voicemail, she left me a message I wouldn't listen to for another day and a half. But she painted a vivid picture. As soon as I had left, as soon as the shock had worn off, my father's instinct for self-preservation kicked in. He didn't see a failing rig. He saw an attack on his name. He saw a stain on his legacy. And he refused to accept that the fault could lie in the steel itself. He retreated to a private office in the museum. His voice, my mother said, a low, angry growl. He didn't call engineers or safety experts. He called his old allies, the lobbyists in Washington, the former executives on the boards of rival companies, the editors at industry trade magazines. His strategy was simple and brutal. Deflect, deny, discredit. He started building an alternate narrative, a story where the Thorne Alpha wasn't a victim of his own flawed design and Julian's reckless cost-cutting. In his new version of reality, the rig was a victim of external forces. He floated theories with the confidence of a man who was used to being believed. It must have been a subsea seismic event, an uncharted geological anomaly that no one could have predicted. Or even better, it was sabotage, a new type of deep-water explosive planted by a rival nation or an eco-terrorist group. He spoke of my work, my warnings not as the inconvenient truth, but as a convenient scapegoat. He suggested to one influential editor that perhaps my aggressive computer models had somehow misinterpreted routine seismic activity, causing a panic that led to a bungled, unnecessary shutdown procedure by an inexperienced crew. He was planting seeds of doubt, trying to muddy the waters so thoroughly that no one could ever find the simple, damning truth. He was leveraging 40 years of goodwill, 40 years of backroom deals and handshakes on the golf course to protect his own pride. He couldn't bear the thought that the foundation of his entire career, the very symbol of his steel and experience mantra, was fundamentally flawed. To admit that would be to admit that he was wrong. And Aris Thorne was never wrong. More than that, to admit his design was flawed would be to admit that I, his daughter, the one who worked with hypothetical models, had been right all along. It was a truth so unbearable, so destructive to his entire sense of self, that he would rather invent conspiracies and blame phantom terrorists than face it. He wasn't just trying to save his reputation. He was trying to rewrite physics. He was trying to bend reality to fit his narrative. It was the ultimate act of arrogance, a man trying to stare down a hurricane and declare that it was nothing but a summer breeze. But the storm was real, and it was a storm of his own making. While my father was spinning his web of denial, I was dealing with the brutal, unforgiving laws of physics. We had arrived at the command staging area, a secure facility on a naval air station buzzing with activity. The disaster was no longer a simulation on my screen. It was a live, evolving crisis, and we were running out of time. My team and I had been working nonstop, fueled by adrenaline and black coffee. The data pouring in from the rig was even worse than I had feared. The primary support joint, the one I had warned them about, was fracturing under the immense deep-sea pressure. It was groaning, shedding metal, threatening to buckle completely. If it went, the entire rig would collapse into the abyss, triggering an oil spill that would make history for all the wrong reasons. Every conventional solution was failing. The remote robotics couldn't get close enough to reinforce the joint. The pressure was too intense. The standard protocols were useless. Panic was a luxury no one could afford, but I could feel the tension tightening in the room with every new terrifying data point. That's when I turned to the solution that everyone else had dismissed. The one I had designed as a theoretical failsafe in my original report 6 months ago. It was a radical, untested idea. It involved using a series of precisely controlled, sequenced implosions on the seafloor nearby. The goal was to rapidly alter the surrounding water pressure, creating a temporary bubble of equilibrium around the failing joint, giving us a window to deploy a new type of hydrostatic polymer brace. It was delicate. It was dangerous. If we miscalculated by even a fraction of a second, the shock waves could be the very thing that finished the rig off for good. I presented the plan to the Secretary of Energy and the Joint Chiefs on a secure video link. I didn't hedge. I didn't soften it. I laid out the data, the risks, and the razor-thin margin for error. I ended by saying, it is our only viable option. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. I could almost hear them weighing the political fallout of a plan that sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. Finally, the secretary's voice came through, tight but resolute. He said, "Dr. Thorne, your predictions have been 100% accurate thus far. You have our authorization. Proceed." For the next 20 minutes, the command center was a symphony of controlled chaos. My voice was calm and steady as I called out the sequence, my team responding in perfect unison. We were a single organism, a hive mind, focused on one impossible task. The countdown was nerve-wracking. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Execute. We watched the screens, our hearts in our throats. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the seismic sensors registered the sequenced implosions. The pressure readings around the failing joint flickered wildly, then stabilized. The groaning of the metal stopped. We had our window. The polymer braces were deployed. They attached, they sealed, they held. A collective sigh of relief, a wave of pure, unadulterated success washed through the command center. We hadn't just stopped the bleeding, we had stabilized the patient. We had averted the catastrophe. It wasn't a public victory. There were no reporters, no applause. But in that room, surrounded by the quiet respect of the best minds in the country, I felt a sense of validation that was more powerful than any public praise. My hobby, my computer models, my theoretical work had just saved a $12 billion asset and protected an entire ecosystem. The truth didn't need a spotlight. It just needed to be right. Our victory, as profound as it was, remained a classified secret for the first few hours. In the world outside our secure command center, a different battle was being waged. It was a war of words, of narratives, of perception. And my brother Julian was leading the charge. Having failed to regain control through demands and intimidation, he had pivoted to the only other weapon he knew how to wield: public relations. With his company on the brink of collapse and his reputation in tatters, he did what desperate, powerful men always do. He hired a crisis management firm, one of the most ruthless and expensive in Washington, D.C., and he went on the offensive. The first wave of their attack was subtle. It started with anonymous sources, strategically leaked to friendly reporters and influential financial bloggers. These sources, almost certainly on Julian's payroll, began to paint a new picture of the disaster. It was a narrative that conveniently ignored the months of my warnings and the years of his own neglect. Instead, they floated a new theory. They suggested that the Thorne Alpha had been perfectly stable until a rash and untested intervention ordered by a low-level government consultant had destabilized the entire structure. They didn't use my name, not at first. They just referred to me as an outside advisor, an academic with no real-world experience, whose panicked theoretical models had caused more harm than good. Then the narrative became more personal, more vicious. They started to question my motives. Another leak this time, to a notoriously aggressive cable news host, hinted that my private consulting firm, Thorne Risk Advisory, stood to gain financially from a prolonged crisis. The implication was disgusting and clear. They were suggesting that I had intentionally exaggerated the risk, that I had perhaps even sabotaged the initial response, all to secure a larger government contract. I watched it unfold on the secondary monitors in the command center, a sick feeling of disbelief twisting in my stomach. I had just led a team that averted an environmental disaster, and Julian was trying to frame me as a war profiteer. He wasn't just trying to save himself anymore. He was actively trying to destroy me. He was taking my greatest professional achievement and twisting it into a crime. The strategy was as brilliant as it was repulsive. It created confusion. It created doubt. In the court of public opinion, where headlines matter more than facts, he was turning me from the hero of the story into the villain. It was a desperate, scorched earth campaign designed to do one thing: erase the truth by burying it under an avalanche of lies. The battle against physics was over. The battle for my name, my reputation, and my integrity had just begun. I stood in the relative quiet of a small briefing room adjacent to the main command center, the glow of a news monitor painting silent, ugly headlines on the far wall. For a long time, I just watched the lies spread. I saw my photo next to graphics about corporate greed. I saw so-called experts, people I knew for a fact were on my brother's payroll, furrow their brows and talk about the serious ethical questions surrounding the incident. A part of me, the part that had been conditioned for decades to avoid conflict with my family, wanted to ride it out. I had done my job. I had saved the rig. The truth was on my side, locked away in secure government servers and data logs. I believed, or wanted to believe, that eventually the truth would win. I could just stay quiet, finish the mission, and let the facts speak for themselves in some dry, official report months from now. That was the old Aris, the one who absorbed blows, who endured dismissals, who believed that being right was enough. But something had changed in me. It wasn't just about being right anymore. It was about refusing to be wronged. My secure phone buzzed. It was a text from the Secretary of Energy. It read, "We know this is slander, Dr. Thorne. We stand behind you. But the political pressure is mounting. The White House is getting nervous." That was the moment of crystallization. My silence wasn't strength. It was a vacuum. And my brother, my father, and their army of spin doctors were gleefully filling that vacuum with poison. My silence wouldn't protect the truth. It would suffocate it. It would allow their lies to set, to harden into the accepted version of history. It would not only tarnish my name, but it would dishonor the tireless, brilliant work of my entire team. It would send a message to every honest scientist and engineer that in the end, the narrative of powerful men mattered more than their data. I thought about the young engineers on my team who looked at me not just as a boss, but as a mentor. What would my silence teach them to back down when challenged, to let their work be stolen and smeared? No, not anymore. I picked up the phone. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call a PR agent. I called the one person in Washington who owed me a favor, the head of the Congressional Oversight Committee, a man whose own state's coastline I had just saved from devastation. When he answered, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sound angry or victimized. I sounded like the professional I was. I said, Congressman, my name is Dr. Aris Thorne. I have some information regarding the Thorne Alpha incident that I believe your committee will find highly relevant. I am prepared to deliver a full unclassified briefing with evidence in a public hearing at your earliest convenience. I paused, then added the words that sealed my decision. I said I have stayed silent long enough. Julie and my father. They wanted a war of words. They wanted a fight in the mud. I wasn't going to give them that. I was going to give them something far worse. A stage, a microphone, and the cold, hard, undeniable truth. I did not want this fight, but they had chosen it for me, and I intended to finish it. The hearing room on Capitol Hill was packed. The air was thick with the scent of ambition and anticipation. Every major news network had a camera crew present their lenses, like a firing squad aimed at the witness table. In the front row sat my brother Julian, his face a tight mask of coached confidence, a high-priced lawyer at his side. A few seats down, my father Harrison Thorne sat stone-faced, the patriarch summoned to defend his tarnished legacy. They had come expecting to control the narrative. They had no idea the narrative was about to control them. When I walked in, a hush fell over the room. I wasn't flanked by lawyers. I was alone. I took my seat, arranged my notes, and looked directly at the committee chairman. He gave me a solemn nod, and the floor was mine. I began my voice, steady, amplified by the microphones. It filled the cavernous room. I said, Chairman, members of the committee, for the past 72 hours, the public has been fed a story of incompetence and greed. Today, I am here to provide the facts. I didn't use rhetoric. I didn't appeal to emotion. I used data. The same way I had in the command center. First, on the large screen behind me, I displayed the initial report I had submitted to Thorne Energy 6 months prior. I highlighted the specific section where I warned of catastrophic failure in the P12 support joint. I said, this was not an unforeseen event. It was a documented, predictable outcome. Next, I played a recording. It was an audio file of the family meeting, the one I had recorded for my own records. The committee listened in stunned silence as my father's voice boomed through the chamber, dismissing my work as computer models. They heard Julian laugh off my warnings as a science fair. The public relations spin evaporated in the face of their own damning words. Then I presented the email chains, the ones where Julian explicitly ordered the cutbacks on the very maintenance protocols I had flagged as essential, the ones where he prioritized quarterly earnings over federally mandated safety inspections. I moved calmly from one piece of evidence to the next, the operational logs showing the rig being pushed beyond its documented limits. The financial records detailing the millions saved by their negligence. It was a slow, methodical, and brutal dissection of their lies. I wasn't just telling a story. I was presenting an unshakable case. Finally, I looked away from my notes and directly at my brother. I said, while I and my team were working to prevent an environmental disaster, Mr. Julian Thorne was not trying to help. He was busy hiring a crisis management firm to plant false stories in the media, accusing me of the very greed that led him to this precipice. I let the weight of that statement settle in the silent room. I had not raised my voice. I had not attacked them personally. I had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection was ugly, undeniable, and entirely of their own making. The war of words was over. The truth had just had the final say. The aftermath of the hearing was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. Before the chairman had even officially adjourned the session, my testimony was already rocketing across the globe. The video clips went viral. The audio of my father dismissing my work, his arrogant tone echoing in millions of headphones, became a symbol of a generation of expertise being ignored by the old guard. For Julian, the consequences were swift and brutal. The high-priced lawyer at his side could do nothing to stop the avalanche. Within hours, the board of directors of Thorne Energy convened an emergency meeting. Faced with irrefutable evidence of his gross negligence and the spectacular collapse of their stock price, their decision was unanimous. Julian Thorne was fired effective immediately. His reign as CEO, the one he had protected with lies and slander, had lasted less than 2 years. The statement from the board was cold and clinical, thanking him for his service and announcing an immediate full-scale internal investigation. The empire he was so proud of had publicly executed him to save itself. For my father, the fallout was quieter, but in many ways more profound. There was no board to fire him from. He was already a legend in retirement, but legends are built on stories, and his story had been irrevocably shattered. The industry trade magazines that once quoted him like a prophet were now running headlines about the Thorne Alpha controversy and the arrogance of an aging icon. His phone calls to old allies went unanswered. The lobbyists who once fawned over him suddenly couldn't recall his name. He wasn't a criminal, but in the world he had built, he had been handed a fate far worse. He had become irrelevant. His legacy of steel had rusted overnight. The most satisfying consequence, however, was the official one. The day after the hearing, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, announced a formal investigation into Thorne Energy for misleading its investors. The Department of Justice followed suit, launching a criminal investigation into Julian for his role in the disaster, citing potential violations of the Clean Water Act and other federal safety regulations. I watched it all unfold from a quiet hotel room in D.C. The noise of the television, a distant murmur. I didn't feel a sense of celebratory triumph. I didn't feel elation. What I felt was a deep, quiet sense of rightness, like a fractured bone that had finally been set correctly. The world was snapping back into alignment. The truth, it turned out, didn't need me to shout. It just needed a platform. I had given it one, and it had done the rest of the work on its own. The lies, the arrogance, the entire carefully constructed facade of the Thorne men had been brought down not by an attack, but by the simple, unstoppable weight of the facts. They had built their house on sand, and I had just introduced it to the tide. The empire wasn't just cracking, it was dissolving. A week after the hearing, after the headlines had peaked and the lawyers had taken over, I agreed to meet him. Not because he asked, but because I knew I needed to. He chose a neutral location, a quiet park bench overlooking the Potomac River, far from the whispers of Capitol Hill and the glare of television cameras. When I arrived, he was already there, staring out at the gray, choppy water. He looked like a stranger. The imposing, formidable presence of Harrison Thorne was gone, replaced by a man who seemed diminished, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. He looked frail. He looked old. I didn't sit down. I stood a few feet away, the cool morning air, a barrier between us. He turned his eyes searching my face for something I no longer possessed. Forgiveness, perhaps. Or maybe a flicker of the daughter he thought he knew. He was the first to speak his voice, raspy, stripped of its usual booming authority. He said, "I saw what you did. It was thorough." I just nodded my hands in the pockets of my coat. He tried again, his gaze dropping to the ground. He said, "I never meant. I was proud of you, Aris, in my own way. I just didn't understand what you did." The excuse was so old, so worn out, it was almost pathetic. I had heard it my whole life. I didn't hate him for it. I didn't feel anything at all. It was like observing a failed experiment. His way of understanding the world, his rigid definitions of success and strength, had been tested, and they had been found wanting. I said, "You understand profit and you understand steal. That's all you ever valued. What I do is about protecting people. It's about preventing the very disasters that men like you and Julian create with your pride and your greed. It was never a language you were interested in learning." He flinched a small, barely perceptible motion. He finally looked up at me, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. He said, "I'm your father." I met his gaze, my own clear and calm. For the first time, I felt no need to fight, no need to prove myself, no need to win his approval. The battle was already over. I said legacy isn't about the name you pass down. It's about the choices you make. It's about the truths you're willing to face. You once told me my work was a hobby. You were wrong. My work is saving lives. Your legacy, the one you built on silence and arrogance, is a multi-billion-dollar wreckage at the bottom of the ocean. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the old worn key to the family lake house, a place where I had spent summers feeling like an outsider. I placed it gently on the bench beside him. I said goodbye, Harrison. I used his first name. It was a final, quiet severing of a tie that had only ever brought me pain. I turned and walked away without looking back, the sound of the river filling the silence. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just free. The soundscape transitions to one of quiet, constructive power. The gentle, confident clicking of a keyboard, the calm hum of an office, a tone of rebuilding and forward motion. In the weeks that followed, the legal and financial fallout for Thorne, energy was immense. The company was bleeding money, facing mountains of lawsuits, and its reputation was in ruins. The new board of directors, desperate to signal a change, approached me through official channels. They offered a formal public apology and a substantial financial settlement for the damages to my reputation and my firm. They wanted to write a check, close the chapter, and move on. The old Aris might have been tempted. The money was significant, more than enough to ensure a comfortable life, a quiet victory. But I wasn't the old Aris. I had walked through fire not for money, but for truth. And I knew this was a rare opportunity, a moment of leverage that could be used for something far more valuable than personal gain. I refused their settlement offer. Instead, through my lawyers, I made a counterproposal. It was unconventional, it was bold, and it was non-negotiable. I didn't want their money for myself. I wanted it for the future. My proposal was this: I would agree to waive all personal claims against Thorne Energy. I would not sue them. In return, the company would be legally bound to allocate the entirety of its net profits for the next 5 years, not to its shareholders, but to a new independent entity. An entity that I would create and oversee. It would be called the Foundation for Industrial Safety and Accountable Leadership. The proposal sent shockwaves through their boardroom. It was unheard of. A company's profits are sacred, but they were trapped. A public court battle with me, the woman who was now being hailed as a Cassandra of the corporate world, would be corporate suicide. The evidence was overwhelmingly on my side. Refusing my offer would look like the ultimate act of bad faith, confirming everything the public already believed about their culture of greed. They had no choice. Reluctantly, with their backs against the wall, They agreed it was the ultimate vindication. I wasn't just taking their money, I was taking their purpose. For 5 years, the engine of their greed would be forced to fuel an engine of change. The profits generated by their risk-taking would be used to fund the very research and oversight that would prevent such risks from ever being taken again. I had turned their punishment into a legacy. Not Harrison's legacy of steel, not Julian's legacy of profit, but a new legacy. It would be a legacy of accountability, funded by the very company that had tried to silence me. It was a victory far sweeter than any personal settlement. I hadn't just won the battle. I had rewritten the terms of the war. I had taken the ashes of their fallen empire and planted the seeds of something better, something that would last. 1 year later, the world looked very different. The Foundation for Industrial Safety and Accountable Leadership wasn't just a legal entity on paper. It was a thriving, breathing institution. We had taken over a modern, sunlit office building in downtown Denver, a city at the heart of America's new energy and engineering sectors. The walls were glass, a deliberate choice. We had nothing to hide. The initial profits from Thorne Energy, now under new, humbled leadership, had begun to flow in. We used that money not for lavish galas or marble floors, but to fund the brightest minds in the country. We established research grants for doctoral students, developing safer materials. We funded independent audits of major industrial sites. We created open-source software that allowed smaller companies to run the same kind of complex risk simulations that I had once used alone. My role had changed. I was no longer a consultant working in the shadows. I was the public face of a movement. I spent my days not in crisis command centers, but in lecture halls and university auditoriums. I spoke to the next generation of engineers, the young men and women who would one day be designing the infrastructure of the world. I didn't talk to them about balance sheets or profit margins. I talked to them about ethics, about the courage to speak truth to power, about the immense responsibility that came with their knowledge. In one of these sessions at the Colorado School of Mines, I was holding a Q&A after my speech. A young woman in the front row, her eyes bright with a familiar intensity, raised her hand. She asked Dr. Thorne, "You had every reason to destroy that company, to take the money and walk away. Why did you choose to rebuild something with it instead?" I paused, looking out at the sea of young, hopeful faces. I thought of my father, of Julian, of the lonely years spent trying to prove my own worth. I said, "Because punishment ends. It's a full stop. But accountability, true. Accountability is a beginning. It's a process. Anyone can tear something down. It's much harder and much more important to build something better in its place. We don't need more fallen empires. We need stronger foundations." The applause that followed was warm, genuine. It was a different kind of validation from the one I had felt in the command center. That was about being right. This was about doing good. I saw the impact not just in the lecture halls, but in the culture of the industry itself. Companies started proudly displaying their FISA-certified ratings, the safety standards we had developed. The Thorne Report, a once dismissed document, was now required reading in engineering ethics courses across the country. I wasn't just a survivor of a corporate war anymore. I was an architect of change. I had taken the ugliest chapter of my life and turned it into a textbook for others. I was building a new legacy, not from steel or from profit, but from the one thing my family had never understood: purpose. I don't live in a high-rise apartment in a bustling city anymore. My home is a small, modern house I designed myself, nestled in the foothills just outside of Denver. From my back porch, I can see the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, a constant humbling reminder of the power and permanence of nature. Most mornings, I sit out here with a simple cup of black coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky. The noise of the past has finally faded. The angry headlines, the frantic phone calls, the bitter words, in that hearing room, they're all just echoes now. They no longer have any power over me. My life is not defined by that battle. It's defined by what came after. Sometimes I get updates. Julian, after a lengthy and humiliating legal battle, avoided prison time but is barred from ever serving as an officer of a public company again. He lives a quiet life somewhere in Florida. His name a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. My father remains in self-imposed exile, in his mansion, a lonely king, in a kingdom of one, his legacy forever footnoted with the story of the Thorne Alpha. I do not feel anger towards them. I do not feel pity. I simply do not feel them at all. They are ghosts from a different life. My life is here. It's in the quiet satisfaction of reading a new research paper funded by our foundation. It's in the email from a young engineer who used our open source software to convince her boss to reinforce a bridge. It's in the sound of laughter from the interns brainstorming in the foundation's main hall. From my porch, I can sometimes hear the distant steady sounds of construction. They're building a new national research center for advanced materials a few miles down the valley. The lead architect, a brilliant woman I had the honor of mentoring, is using a new type of composite steel in its foundation, a material developed through a grant from our foundation, a material that is stronger, safer, and more resilient than anything my father ever could have imagined. I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sunset cast a warm, golden glow on the mountains. I wasn't thinking about revenge or vindication. I wasn't thinking about my family or the empire they lost. I was thinking about how a legacy isn't something you inherit or build from steel. It isn't measured in profit or power. A true legacy is like light. It is measured by what it illuminates, by what it helps to grow, and by the warmth it leaves behind long after the source is gone. I took a sip of my coffee. The air was cool, clean, and full of promise. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace. The war was over. I had survived. And in the quiet aftermath, I had finally truly built something that would last. Thank you for staying with me through Aris's entire journey. Her story began with a public humiliation, but it ended with a quiet, powerful purpose. It's a reminder that sometimes the world will dismiss your voice, your knowledge, and your worth. It will try to make you feel small, like your contributions are just a hobby. The most important lesson here isn't about revenge. It's about resilience. It's about knowing that your value isn't determined by those who refuse to see it. It's determined by your own actions, by your integrity, and by the courage to stand by your truth, even when you're standing alone. It's about taking the broken pieces of what they tried to tear down and building something stronger and better in its place. I have a question for you. Have you ever had a moment where your expertise was dismissed only to be proven right later on? How did it make you feel? Share your story in the comments below. Because your experience matters. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story of justice and vindication. Until next time, stay strong and trust in your own truth.